Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Katie Bishop. Katie is the author of The Girls of Summer. Her writing has been published in the New York Times, The Guardian, Vogue, The Independent, and other publications. She lives in Birmingham, UK with her partner, and High Season is her second book. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's so exciting. Look at this gorgeous cover. Now, this is your US cover. I always love what they do differently. Do you have a copy of your UK? I just
I
on this.
have one just right here, just beside me. Just give me a
Yes,
second.
let's look at it. I always love looking at them side by side. I think that's so fun.
Here it is.
Okay, gorgeous. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually love them both. I feel like for my first novel, The Girls of Summer, I'm probably not supposed to say this, but I really prefer the US cover. Whereas for this one, I really like them both. They've done like quite different things with them, but I think they both work really nicely in different
Right.
ways.
Here we've got the pink house on the US cover, and we've got the water, the pool, on your cover, which is gorgeous. So before we dig into all the things, please tell our listeners a little bit about High Season.
Yeah, so High Season takes place 20 years after a very infamous murder of an heiress and socialite called Tamara Drayton. And she was found dead in the pool of her family's beautiful villa in the south of France. And the only witness to Tamara's murder was her sister, Nina. But the only problem was that Nina was only 5 years old when she saw the murder. But she ended up being the only witness in the murder trial. It led to the conviction of their housekeeper's daughter, Josie Jackson. And when we pick up the book, it's 20 years later. And the thing is that even though this murder has really kind of shaped Nina's life since, she doesn't really remember it. She remembers testifying, she remembers kind of telling the story, but she doesn't remember really what she actually saw at the time. And at the beginning of the novel, a true crime TikToker has started a series about this case, which goes enormously viral. A true crime documentary starts to get made about it. And they reach out to Nina and ask her if she'd like to be involved. And this really throws Nina into a huge crisis and draws all this attention back to her. And really the question that everyone is asking is, can you really trust the testimony of a 5-year-old girl? So the novel flashes back and forth between these two really key summers. Firstly, the summer that Tamara was killed, and secondly, the summer that Nina goes back to this villa in the south of France where Tamara was killed to kind of try and find out the truth. And we're told the story by Nina, by Josie, who was the person who was convicted of the murder, and actually by Tamara herself, comes back and has a little point of view as well. And it really kind of explores the true crime phenomenon, which is something that I'm very, very interested in. The nature of memory, which I've really explored across both my books. So again, is a little bit of a fascination for me. And really just how narratives kind of change and are reshaped as we tell them, whether that is when you tell the same story over and over again and how it changes with each retelling, or how narratives, when they're online, kind of take on a life of their own as different creators kind of tell and retell them, and different people comment on them and engage with them. How that really reshapes a narrative in kind of a similar but also very different way too.
And first of all, I love this book. I tore through it, as I said before, we started recording. And I love the true crime podcast. I'm going to say, and there's no spoilers on Killer Women, but I particularly loved the way that wraps up. And you have to read the book to understand what I'm Katie knows what I'm talking about, but right now only we do. Because I just felt like that was so satisfying to me. But let's go back. I'm always so curious about where the stories come from, how they develop in your mind. So can you and not we can't always even remember. So, as we dig into the truth of memory, can you recall sort of how this story started in your mind?
So I think a lot of stories, when you talk to authors, tend to come from different places. There's never really one main idea. But for me, both of the primary ideas really did come from true crime itself. I feel like sometimes when I explain the premise of the book, people think it's going to be quite judgmental about true crime, and it does definitely probe into it and kind of look at the ethics. But it couldn't be too judgmental because I used to be a huge, huge true crime fan, and my relationship with it has kind of changed over the years. But the idea for the book did come from it. And first of all, it came from a documentary that I watched about a particular real life case where a 7-year-old child had to testify against their mother in the murder of their sister. And the mother was convicted, went to prison, but even to this day maintains her innocence. And that child now is, they're kind of in their late 20s, early 30s. And when I watched that, I was just so fascinated by that idea because I was thinking, firstly, even if you were telling the truth and this, you're told things exactly as you saw them, that would still be an incredibly harrowing thing to have to do that would really impact the rest of your life. But also another idea that I just couldn't stop thinking about was, well, what if kids make stuff up all the time. And what if you had made something up that then completely changed everyone's life around you? What if you hadn't made it up? But obviously, sometimes when people are very young, the way that they tell stories, the way they communicate things can get kind of mixed up. And what if maybe you just actually didn't know what the truth was? You didn't know if you'd made it up. You didn't know if the story had changed. You didn't know if it was actually completely true. And everyone's saying, well, we were adults at the time you were telling the story. We remember how you told it. It was very, very convincing. Do you believe that? Or do you believe yourself and what you remember and know now? So that was an idea that I was really interested in, but I couldn't quite figure out how to turn it into a novel at that point. And also, I think, as all writers will probably say, you've always got about 50 ideas for a novel kind of bubbling away in the back of your head, and you're never quite sure which one will come and really turn into a great idea that can, fill 350 pages. So then the other thing that really pushed me towards writing this novel, I am a huge TikTok addict. I watch way too much TikTok, spend way too much time scrolling. And there was a point where there was a very famous murder case going on kind of a couple of years ago. And it was just absolutely everywhere on my TikTok, and all these kind of amateur sleuths were just obsessed with it and coming up with all these theories. And I found myself watching so many videos of it to the point where I was kind of scared to be in my house on my own because it was just permeating my life so much. I just couldn't stop thinking about it. And after a point, I thought, gosh, how crazy that this thing that's happening, actually it was in America, so thousands of miles from me, is obsessed me so much. And also how kind of ghoulish that we're all kind of sitting there watching it as if it's just entertainment, as if these aren't real people, and talking about real people involved in it whose lives are going to be really, really affected by it. In this particular case, there were a couple of people who were very involved in the murder, and were witnesses, and were very young. And I just thought, gosh, this is really going to be a trauma that follows them for their entire life. So these ideas were kind of starting to come together, and I was really starting to think about both the ethics of true crime and how fascinating it is when those things really get tangled up in someone's life and impact them in a way that the people watching the true crime and creating the true crime content probably aren't thinking about in a great amount of detail.
Right. Well, and so there's a bunch of things I want to talk about with what you just said, and the first is that I do want to talk about sort of the judgmental, like there is, I mean, even to sort of self-judgment when we get obsessed with sort of a crime and thinking, why are we so obsessed with this crime? And I think true crime, as you probably know, is mostly consumed by women.
Mm-hmm.
So we're sort of massively the people who watch and listen and read true crime. And I always sort of wonder, is that because we're more apt to be the victims of crime?
Mm-hmm.
Is it because, this for the same reason I love thrillers, it sort of gives you this opportunity to sort of decide how you might handle the same situation if it happened to you. But I also love the fact that, even that you as a narrator or you as an author remove judgment from most of the aspects of this book. I don't sense judgment of the woman who was, who tried and convicted, of Nina, who is, mis or maybe not misremembering it, of Imogen, who's the true crime, any of it. So, which is lovely because you let the reader make her own decisions. So that is amazing. But let's talk about the memory thing again, because it's one of the comments of one of the characters in the books, and I'm not going to remember who it is that, yeah, I know I don't remember going to kindergarten. I don't remember showing up, right, for the first day of school, but of course I went. And so that's
Mhm.
sort of this idea that, that, and even if something traumatic, right, I mean, I had a broken arm, but I don't remember, like, you don't remember it, right? And so the
Mhm.
question that Nina is, and the reason that she's pursued the line of career she has, all of it, as you said, is that she is a sort of obsessed with, did I do the right thing? Or have I made a mistake? And so as you were, sort of building the book, how did you decide on a 5-year-old? Or, sort of how are those, were you sort of, what were the questions you were sort of trying to sort of ask in your mind as the story started to take shape?
Yeah, so because I sort of the idea was sparked by a real life case, I knew I wanted to have a very kind of young child involved in it and be thinking about memory from that regard. But as you said, I am really, really fascinated by what we remember and what we don't. As you said, there's so many things that we know happened in our lives, but we don't remember them. And also something that I'm really interested in is so many things that happen in our lives that we do remember, but possibly what we're remembering isn't entirely accurate. And that's not even true when you're thinking about childhood memories. There'll be so often where I'll be together with friends and we'll be talking about something that happened, perhaps in our 20s, much closer than when we were 5. And someone will start telling a story and you say, no, I was there. I remember this story. I don't remember it happening like that. And you've got these different versions of the same event and you're both so convinced that what you're remembering is true, but they can't both be true. So I was very interested in that idea and thinking about, well, if that can happen to you as an adult, it can certainly happen to you as a child, and it can certainly happen when there's a story where you have had to think about it over and over again, and it has shaped so much of your life, and it's really shaped your own perception of yourself, and maybe perhaps that memory has been reshaped because it has to be reshaped, right? Because if kind of who you are
Yeah.
is the person who testified in this enormous, extremely famous murder case,
Right.
it kind of has to be true, right? What you said. Like, otherwise, you have to confront something quite massive about yourself and about your life.
Right. The decision was made for you when you were just, unable to make a decision about how, like Nina had no choice, right?
Mm-hmm.
She saw something, she said something, and, and then it does, as you say, in the same ways that it impacts all of these young people. I mean, the woman convicted was also a teenager. Like they were so, so young. And I think, to a much lesser extent, all of us have those things that shape us, right? But not, of course, like this. So when you imagine the story, because there are also I mean, we also have Hannah. So, Josie is the one who's convicted. Hannah is another sort of local, towny, not the wealthy sort of people who show up in the summertime, but, and this is all set in the south of France and so, picturesque and really fun to read about. So there's these two girls and Hannah, did you have all these characters in place? So one of the other things we talked about before we started recording is that you, in your acknowledgments, talk about the process of,
Mm-hmm.
this book coming to fruition and being a struggle. It's your second book. We all sort of know this sophomore novel and how tough that is. So I'm curious to know sort of what you started with and how it evolved to be this, the fabulous book that it is. Were the characters all there? Has it changed a ton?
So the book changed a lot. As you said, I mentioned in my acknowledgements, writing a second book was an extremely different process to writing my first book that was published. But my first book that was published was not the first book that I wrote, as is the case for many people.
Yes.
But the first book I published was a complete dream to write. I wrote it very quickly. It didn't really change drastically from the draft I first got an agent with and submitted to an agent to the draft that eventually published. So that was an incredible experience. And obviously, you get this book deal, and you think, okay, right, well, surely this is only going to boost my confidence getting a book deal. I've kind of had this confirmation now that I can put a book together. So you kind of go into it thinking, oh, and also, I've been very lucky. I've got the backing of a publisher now. Thought it was going to be amazing. Ended up just having a complete breakdown, essentially. I actually wrote 2 entire books, completely different books, nothing to do with High Season, that I scrapped. Which I will not be returning to because they were not very good. Eventually came to write High Season, and as you said, it was a very, very different book in the first draft, Tamara as a character, who is the person who is murdered, doesn't actually exist in that first draft. The person who was murdered was actually a child, which was interesting to work with in terms of, again, those themes of memory and how the world looks so different when you're a child. But I really love writing coming of age stories. So that was really, really pulling at me. And I just wrote a first draft and it just wasn't working. And the thing that needed to change was that there needed to be a different person who died. So that was obviously a huge, huge change. And in that second draft, you mentioned there that there's the other character of Hannah, who's the kind of townie, and her and Josie Jackson are really a very, very different class to Tamara, who's Tamara Drayton, who's a socialite who's killed, and her sister, and her mother, who's this kind of extremely, extremely glamorous socialite from the kind of 1960s, 1970s. He's this kind of faded starlet who's, been married 4 times and had this kind of crazy wild life. I think in that draft as well, once I introduced Tamara as a character and a character with a voice, because that was the other challenge writing when the person who was killed was a child, it was very, very difficult to give them a narrative voice. And something that was really, really important to me was that I did want the person who was killed to have a narrative voice, because again, that's something that's really lost quite often in the true crime genre. I think often you are hearing cases about women who are murdered and you very, very rarely hear who they were as people or really see them, or their voice is the one that's lost. So it was important to me that the person who was killed did have a voice, which was another reason why bringing in Tamara as a character was really important. But also that kind of upstairs downstairs element, that's a huge part of the book. You have the book really divided between the haves and the have-nots, the people who are extraordinarily wealthy in a way that most of us couldn't even dream of, and are living these extremely beautiful privileged lives. Even when something kind of horrific happens to them, they've still got, these mansions and these riches and whole teams of staff. And then on the flip side of it, you have the stories of those staff who they live in the same world, they inhabit literally the same town, the same land, but their lives really, really could not be more different. And that was something that in that draft, again, with the introduction of Tamara as a character, was something that I was really able to explore on a much deeper level as well.
And there's there's Josie and Hannah, who are the towny young people, and then there's Tamara and her brother, her twin brother, Blake, who are the sort of, so there's this little cluster of, as you said, coming of age. It's actually is exactly right, which is you sort of manifested this beautiful. There's all these other things we learn and see and experience in the book that really don't have anything necessarily to do with the sort of the true crime element or the sort of primary Nina, because of course at the time Nina is 5, so she's completely excluded, although Josie is her babysitter, and so she's, so that I thought that was so wonderfully layered. And I want to talk about, I call this imposter syndrome. I have published 16, my 17th book will be out in February, and it's still, I mean, I think it's always there. So what would you say to aspiring authors or authors who publish one book and are now in sort of the bowels, shall we say, of book 2? What sort of has emerged for you after this, clearly a very successful creation, book 2? I know it's not out yet, but I can already sense it's going to be wonderful. So how would you guide people suffering that same experience?
Yeah, so as I kind of said there, I think when you get a book deal, everyone's like, oh, you'll get second book syndrome. The second book's really, really hard to write. I really don't think I've met anyone else who had quite the experience I had with writing the second book in terms of literally scrapping 2 entire novels. So it was quite extreme for me. But I do think I've really taken something away from that. And on the kind of same token as well, having with that very first book that I wrote, as well, as I mentioned, tried to get an agent with it, was unsuccessful in getting an agent with it. And with all of those books, the thing that people always say is, oh, well, are you kind of keeping it in a drawer to sort of revisit at some point? And I always say, absolutely not, because there's a reason why that first book didn't get an agent. There was a reason why I binned those other 2 books. So the thing I always say to people now, when I talk to people who ask me for kind of advice on being a writer, is just to really treat everything as a learning experience. Because even though I did have that enormous crisis of confidence with that second book, I do know now that I am a stronger writer as a result of having written, so gosh, I've now written 5 books, 2 of which have been published. But those 2 books that have been published would not be the books they were without the 3 books that did not get published. So I think it's very, very hard when you're writing a manuscript and you're not published. But I think it is good to just really don't look at it as being like, this is the book that's going to get me an agent, get me a publisher, launch my career. And like, if it does, that's amazing, that's brilliant, but it's also a bonus. If you just write a book and it teaches you how to write, and it gets things off your chest, and it kind of teaches you about the kind of writer that you want to be, I think that's incredibly valuable in and of itself. And it's probably just going to bring you closer to writing the book that you are supposed to write, and the book that will be a success.
That's great advice. And do you feel like when now you're probably already working on book three, or at least sort of like pulling together the pieces, how, what sort of, as you do that, what are sort of the things you might do a little bit differently? Or are you just like, now that you sort of had this experience, you just know that you have to sort of move through it. The sort of viscous discomfort of every book in some way, right, will be really hard.
Yeah, I think that viscous discomfort is a really important thing to be aware of, because I now know that at every single point in writing a book, there's going to be a point when you absolutely hate it and you think, oh my gosh, I can't write. I don't know what I'm doing. Why is someone giving me this money to write a book? I need to check my bank balance and see if I can afford to pay it back. And now I just need to go and sit with a glass of wine and cry and watch some Real Housewives or something. And now I know that happens every single time. And there will be a point where you sit down at your desk and you read what you've written and you're like, you know what, this is actually okay. So I think, yeah, learning to sit in that. I love that viscous discomfort. That's a really great phrase. That's really, really important. But also just from a more kind of practical and less psychological level, I think I've really learned the value of having a good hook in a book.
Yeah.
And definitely, I would say my 2 books that I've published do have strong hooks, which is obviously that kind of one line elevator pitch when you kind of say it to people and people are like, oh, I'm interested in that idea. I can now see that the problem with the very first book I wrote was that it didn't have a hook. It was just me loving writing and wanting to get things off my chest and wanting to write something that I think, as a piece of work, there's some really nice things in it. I think it really was me as a person in lots of ways, but it didn't have that thing where you tell people what the idea is and people say, oh, that's really interesting, which I think is that moment that now I'm like, authors live for, when you tell people the idea for your book and they want to know more. So I think I've now learned not to just kind of run into writing something because I'm excited about it and just start, opening up a Word document and getting down to it, trying to kind of distill that hook and trying to distill what the heart of the novel is and what the thing that's going to make people go, oh, I want to read that is, before you actually start writing.
It's super smart. And it's funny that you say like, imagine that everybody has like 50 ideas. I am literally like one idea at a time. It's all that I have. And in fact, I'm working on, the next book. I've got one coming out February, and then I'm working on the next one. And I am already like, I hope there's an idea out there after that one, because it's all that happens. So when you have a lot of ideas, do you sort of like spend some time with them? How do you sort of decide sort of which of them is the one, that you will work on next?
Yeah, so I have a Word document where I just write ideas down as they come to me. And often they're just kind of a few words, or sometimes they're just a vibe. But I know with my first book that was published at Girls of Summer, I was just like, dark summer romance. And that was kind of the first, sometimes they're just vibes, sometimes they're ideas, sometimes they are little hooks. So then when I actually need to sit down and kind of say to my agent, this is what the next book's going to be, I'll look at that document, and most of them are pretty rubbish. When I say I have 50 ideas, I definitely don't mean that I have 50 ideas. But then I also think I really struggle with committing to an idea. I really respect when people like you say, I'm so impressed by the fact you have one idea and you will just, stick with that. But I think because I have so many ideas, I really, really struggle to commit to one, which is maybe why I do often start writing and then scrap novels, because I feel like I need to write my way into it a little bit. And I definitely do my best thinking actually while I'm writing, which is pretty inconvenient because often I'll have to write 10,000 words to think, this isn't working. But everyone has a process, and
Sure.
some parts of everyone's process are just not very convenient, I think.
So you're no, and I agree, and I love that you think it's admirable. The one idea is sort of like it's a little bit of a desperation, right? When you only have one, you sort of figure out
Mm,
how to make it work. But I like you said, everybody's process is really different. And when you so you're not, assuming by the way you talk about that, and I'm the same. Like I have to write my way into a story. I sort of know enough to be dangerous, but I don't know everything when I get started. So I'm assuming that means that you really aren't plotting. You're not a plotter per se.
I'm not a natural plotter.
Okay.
I am a plotter by force, I would say. And I think, when people ask you what your process is, I would say thus far my process has been different for every single book, which is
Fair.
probably a little bit part of kind of learning on the job, and a little bit part of, I don't know, maybe it just always looks like that. I'm not sure. Definitely at first I was very, very much just go into it right, kind of see what the characters do. And then kind of as soon as I was doing this more professionally and less for fun, I realized that that is a really challenging way to write, because I would always get so stuck at the end, and I'd always have such a crisis when it was coming to the end, and I could just see the having to write the end kind of looming on the horizon for me, and it was coming ever closer, and I had no idea what it was going to be. So I do try to plot a little bit more now, but I try to be like really flexible with the plotting, and as much as actually thinking about the story, I try and think about how I want the reader to feel at each stage of the novel, because I think that's a really, really, maybe the most important thing, I think. But of course, because I do write suspense novels, and this book actually is even more of a kind of suspense thriller novel than my previous books have been. This one, for sure, I really realized the value of plotting, and I don't really think you can write a good thriller suspense novel without at least a little bit of plotting.
So do you say a little bit? Are you sort of like you sort of start and well you know the ending? What is it? Are you creating sort of like the where the pivot points are? What does a little bit of plotting look like?
So pretty much all of my books that I've written so far have flashed back and forwards through time,
Mhm.
because I think even when I try and write a book that doesn't do that, I always find myself being drawn back to it, because I'm very, very interested in kind of psychology and memory again. And I think who we are is really a composite of all of our different life experiences. And I find it hard to write a character without revisiting those different experiences at various points. And, those are the kind of books that I love reading as well. So that definitely takes an element of plotting to know when we're going to go back and forth in time. What are the key moments in this person's life that we need to see that are going to be relevant to their situation that we're seeing in the present day? So that's really the main plotting that I do, just to kind of make sure that we have enough of those that are put together in a way that drives the plot forward and that feel compelling, and that you don't feel like the past strand is kind of dragging, or that the present strand is maybe less exciting. Just kind of keeping them both, so the reader, each time they finish one of those sections, they're excited to get back to the next time that timeline comes in, but also that they're not bored when they get into the new timeline that we're in. I think that's a really delicate balance, and that
It
definitely is something that I
is.
really focus on in writing.
It is I feel like it is a delicate balance, and you do it really beautifully. When you're writing this way, are you sort of do you go back and forth? I have the book that's coming out next year is similar, and it goes back and forth between sort of that girls in high school and now. And I did find, that I would write parts of the past and then be like it would feel sort of off sync from, and I have to sort of rearrange where they come back in.
Mm.
How does that, are you sort of thinking you sort of have the past mapped out and then sort of the future, and do you know how they integrate, or is that more of a sort of work in progress?
Yeah, usually I know how they integrate, and I'm really always really interested in talking to other people who do back and forth. So I'd love to know how you do it, because I know some people will just write the entire entirety of one timeline and then the entirety of the other timeline and then kind of slot them together. I don't like doing that. I'm actually quite strict with myself in terms of trying to write my book completely as it will appear, kind of in the order it would appear on the page, just because I always, there's always scenes I'm really excited to write and that I want to go away and write, but I know that if I do that, what I'm going to end up with is all the scenes I didn't want to write at the end, and that's just going to be a train wreck. So
Right.
so I try and write things in the order that they're going to appear, so that I'm getting a mix of chapters I'm excited to write and chapters that are going to be more challenging to write as I go along. But also because, again, writing suspense, I do think it's so important that things slot together in a way that does build the suspense, build the tension. This book's obviously got a lot of kind of mystery and intrigue. It's maybe not a kind of straight thriller in that there's kind of something exciting happening kind of on every page, but I really wanted to build mystery and intrigue. And for me, that's the kind of page turneriness of this novel,
Oh yeah, I think it's very
more
much
so than a lot of action.
yeah, yeah, it's a psychological thriller, which I think
Mm-hmm.
we're used to sort of it not being we're not it's not a spy thriller. Nobody's
Yes.
running around chasing each other with guns, but it's very much a thriller. And I agree with you. I don't know how people would write all of one timeline and all of another timeline. Although, I can imagine I mean, obviously, like you said, it works differently for everyone. But I think in order for them to integrate, it makes sense to sort of go back and forth. And I like the idea that you're like, there's the scene I want to write, but it's 4 scenes away, and I'm not going to cheat and let
Mm.
myself get there. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now? And I understand not, sometimes it's like, nope, it's just in the box, and I can't talk about it yet.
Yeah, I'm writing something. Yeah, I don't know how much I can say about it just yet, but I will say it is different in lots of ways. It still flips back and forth through time. This was actually one where I said, I'm absolutely not going to do one flitting back and forth through time. I'm going to just do one that's
Right.
completely chronological. And then I wrote the whole thing and sent it to my agent, and she was like, I feel like there's something missing. And I was like, you know what that's going to be? And then wrote a
Yeah.
whole different timeline, and then actually did have to slot that in. So that one was a time when I did have to do
Yes,
that. And
sure.
it was a new and exciting challenge. But yeah, this one, next one has got a little bit of a supernatural element to it, which is very new for me, but that I really enjoyed writing. So I'm excited to get that finished and kind of do something a little bit different.
Super fun. I also want to acknowledge I really enjoyed the true crime sort of the posts that are like true crime
Mm.
and sort of the banter between the handles that are listening to her, and I thought that was fun too. Was that in the original book?
That was in the original book, yes. And that was something that, you talk about things that were fun to write. I had so much
I'll
fun
bet.
writing that. And I think everyone who's read it has said you can tell that you enjoyed writing that. And also, it's been super fun. So they're basically transcripts of TikTok videos with all the comments beneath them. And it's been really enjoyable for me because now I can justify my time on TikTok as a time that's actually research, which has been really nice.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was really fun. And it was great to try and kind of get the tone
Yeah.
of TikToker. Um, she's someone who's kind of in her late teens. Also get the tone of the comments and kind of, as we said, I wanted to kind of get the demographic right. So it's a lot of women, not all young women, kind of real mix of ages, a mix of different people, mix of different opinions. Some people who are very, oh, you're being so voyeuristic, leave it alone, leave to the police. Some people who just have absolutely wild theories on what happened, which was quite fun because I got to kind of come up with some quite exciting and different theories as I went along. So yeah, that was probably the bit I actually enjoyed writing the most, even though I probably thought to begin with it might be one of the most challenging just to kind of get that voice right. But I really loved writing it.
Yeah, no, and I think it does. It's very authentic and really fun, and you can tell. And it's because we all, of course, acknowledge that there's a little crazy in in the responses that come, and you do a really wonderful job of sort of capturing all of that. Well, it's so exciting. Everybody, if you're not watching us but listening to us, go check out the cover of High Season, Katie Bishop. I really, there's so much beautiful nuance in this book, and it's a very propulsive story as well as one that reaches deep. And as I told Katie before, I've got a quote picked out for a quote of the week, and it was such a pleasure to get a chance to talk about High Season and your experiences with book two and your process. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this chat so much. I'm excited to go and read some of your books now.
Oh, you're very sweet. Everybody, thank you for joining us on Killer Women with Katie Bishop, and we will see you next time. Bye.